What if I told you there exists a town deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a place no map dares to name, a place where entire families vanished, leaving no graves behind, where descendants walked with skin tinged blue, silent and weary, and where, even now, flickering lights haunt windows long abandoned? Welcome to Gothic Ledger. Tonight we crack open the file on one of America's most isolated towns, a settlement condemned by fire, erased from records, yet never truly gone. Before we dive in, I have a question for you. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments below. I love seeing how these forgotten corners of history reach across the globe. And if you're new here, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Your support helps bring more of these unsettling stories into the light. Now picture a hollow so remote that cartographers simply erased it from their maps. A place where generations married within their own until isolation left its mark not only on their lives but on their very skin. Imagine coal fires smoldering beneath the soil, poisoning the earth, and government agents who arrive not to help but to warn visitors away. This is not folklore. This is documented absent secrets locked in journals, ruins preserved like open-air graves. Officially, the town has been abandoned for over 50 years. Unofficially, it persists in census anomalies, in fleeting glimpses of movement at dusk, and in a final, chilling line scrawled in a notebook. We never left. We're waiting for the world to forget. Tonight we descend into the forgotten corridors of Appalachia's darkest secret. There is a place in Appalachia where the map ends, but the story does not. The ridges rise sharply, plunging into mist-choked hollows that once concealed more than wildlife or weather. They concealed entire community settlements, pressed so tightly against the mountains that no cartographer thought them worth marking. Even county records betray the town's existence, appearing on one survey, only to vanish from the next. To approach it was to leave behind the certainty of mapped America and enter a geography defined by memory rumor and the stubborn persistence of families who refused the outside world. The roads were not roads at all, but narrow veins of dirt, carved by wagon wheels, easily erased each spring when rains turned the soil to rivers of clay. Traders bearing salt, preachers promising salvation. Many turned back long before reaching the hollow, deterred by terrain that seemed to fold inward on itself. Travelers whispered of fog that never lifted, of hills that disoriented even the most seasoned guides. Some swore the ridges themselves shifted, making the return journey longer than the approach. Maps told only the story of absence. In an 1874 county atlas, a faint mark indicated a cluster of homes along a mountain branch. By the 1890s edition, it had vanished. Federal surveyors of the 1910s bypassed the hollow, entirely charting surrounding ridges, but leaving a white void where the town once thrived. This erasure was no accident, it was deliberate. To acknowledge the town on a map would have carried responsibility, schools, roads, inspectors. Easier, it seemed, to let it disappear into the folds of the mountains, and disappear it did. Generations lived and died there without appearing on any census. Their graves went unmarked, their names surviving only in oral genealogies whispered across front porches. To those beyond the ridges, the town was invisible. To those within, absence became protection. No maps meant no visitors. No visitors meant their isolation endured. The Appalachian spine has always been a barrier. Here it became a weapon. The mountains cut them off from the march of progress, preserving a way of life that grew stranger with every passing decade. Children were born who had never seen a railroad, never heard the whistle of a train. Families married within the same narrow circle, not always by choice, but by circumstance. Each union folded the bloodline tighter, sealing generations in isolation. And while the outside world surged forward with factories, wars, and the hum of electricity, this town remained untouched, unmarked, unseen. A gap on a page became over generations a wound. That missing name on a county map was more than a clerical error, it was the first sign of a community, drifting beyond history's reach. In Appalachia, where mountains rise like walls, absence is never innocent. It is deliberate, and it is dangerous. This is how the story begins, not with the town's founding, nor with its fall, but with its erasure. A place wiped from maps, yet never erased from the mountains. The first families did not arrive by choice. In the early decades of the 19th century, when the frontier stretched westward with promises of land and liberty, not all who entered the Appalachian spine sought prosperity. Some were pressed there by necessity, others by shame, and a few by the weight of beliefs too heavy for their former homes. The mountains became both refuge and prison for those who did not belong elsewhere. Religious dissenters came first, expelled by congregations unwilling to tolerate unorthodox practices. They carried sacred texts inked in fading script, their theology bent towards secrecy. Faith turned inward, wary of outsiders. Soon scandal-bound families joined them, a widow accused of witchcraft, a man accused of theft but never convicted children, born beyond the recognition of law. These were not pioneers in the traditional sense. They were fugitives of reputation, staking their lives where no sheriff, preacher, or census taker dared to follow. The Homestead Acts opened land to settlers, but here in the Appalachian interior, title and deed meant little. Families built cabins from timber at hand, claimed hollows too remote for surveyors to contest, traded with no one, hunted freely, and buried their dead in soil unmarked by stone. Kin networks formed out of necessity, not choice. A family of 7 became 3 households, then 5 until an entire settlement coalesced, bound not by law, but by blood. Isolation was more than geographic, it was cultural, deliberate. Outsiders who stumbled upon the hollow were turned away in silence, their questions unanswered, their presence unwelcome. Traders spoke of a strange quiet in the place. No laughter, no communal gatherings, only the muffled sounds of work beneath the forest canopy. Even the architecture whispered secrecy, cabins with shuttered windows, low chimneys to keep smoke from rising too high. It was not a town as we know it. There was no courthouse, no square, no schoolhouse. What bound them was exile itself. They were a congregation without a church, a community without a name, surviving by turning inward. Meanwhile, the outside world recorded almost nothing. County clerks in the 1830s noted the sudden absence of families once accounted for in nearby villages. Their lines of descent, which might have threaded through censuses and land records, vanished as if swallowed by the mountains. No explanations were given, and none were sought. For officials, it was easier to let the disappearances remain a mystery than to risk tracking the vanished into terrain that defied jurisdiction. In this way, the settlement's destiny was fixed from its first stones. Secrecy replaced welcome necessity, replaced choice. What began as a haven for dissenters and castaways became within a generation a sealed hollow of kin, bound together more by circumstance than by desire. The shadows of its founding clung to it for decades, shaping its culture, its bloodlines, leaving behind a legacy that grew darker with each passing year. The town began as an omission. By the time it was founded, it had already become a secret. Generations without outsiders left a mark written directly into the skin. What began as whispers of strangeness among the mountain families soon became undeniable. Skin carried a faint blue cast lips, shaded violet even in the healthiest youth hands, tinged as if by cold, though warm to the touch. In a settlement untouched by maps and unseen by law, the bloodlines themselves began to reveal what isolation had etched into their bodies. The condition was no myth. Physicians who encountered similar cases elsewhere would later describe it in clinical terms. Hemoglobin oxygen, a rare metabolic disorder known as methemoglobinemia. But in this forgotten town, no such language existed. The families spoke simply of the mark. A tint passed through generations like inheritance, too strong to escape. Children were born blue, lived blue, and died blue, their pall preserved even in burial. There are parallels in Appalachian law. The Few Gates of Troublesome Creek in Kentucky, a family whose hereditary condition turned their skin shades of indigo. Yet, unlike the Few Gates whose anomaly eventually drew the curiosity of doctors, the families of this hollow remained hidden. No medical survey documented them. No physician wrote their case. Knowledge circulated only in rumor loggers spoke of pale-eyed men, with veins tinged cobalt travelers turned back after glimpsing children whose faces reflected the sky and water. Isolation compounded the anomaly. With each generation, marriages narrowed further within the kin network, folding the same traits back upon themselves. Cousins wed cousins not out of choice, but from absence of alternatives. In these unions, the condition spread until nearly every household bore its shadow. It was not only the skin that carried the mark. Some claimed the families tired quickly, their breath-short bodies thin as if their own blood could not sustain them. Yet, they endured decade after decade, generation after generation. Superstition rose to fill the void medicine left behind. Among their own, the blue tint was proof of belonging, a seal of descent that bound the community together. Among outsiders, it inspired unease. On rare occasions, travelers straying too close glimpsed faces of the town and carried back stories of a cursed hollow of families carrying something unholy in their blood. Over time, these tales deepened the settlement's isolation as fewer dared approach the place where the people bled blue. In truth, the condition was biological, the inevitable consequence of seclusion and repetition. Yet in the Appalachian imagination, where folklore and fact entwine, it became emblematic of something larger, the belief that the mountain could transform those who lingered too long within its walls. By the dawn of the 20th century, the anomaly had become the settlement's defining feature. Their blue-tinted faces were both a mark of endurance and a stigma of entrapment. In the valleys below, the families vanished from record. But in the ridges above, their very skin testified to the price of secrecy, the cost of bloodlines turned inward. Here in the hollow, no map remembered. The human body itself became a document, written not in ink or paper, but in color. Even in homes now collapsing into the earth, traces of their lives remain. The cabins, once filled with bread ovens and worn furniture, hid more than mundane objects. In cedar drawers beneath floorboards lie hand-bound books stitched with thread, too coarse for ornament yet precise for obsession. These journals were not for posterity. They were confessions, instructions, and warnings pressed into every page by the weight of secrecy. Handwriting varied, but obsessions remained constant. The entries spoke of purity of guarding bloodlines against dilution of kinship circles drawn ever tighter. Marriages were recorded not as unions of love, but as measures of survival, mathematical calculations to preserve lineage without fracture. Children's births were documented meticulously, noting not only names and dates, but the precise hue of their skin at birth, the color of the inheritance they carried in their veins. The shades of blue and pale marked them signs of belonging or of suspicion. In some journals, entire branches of families were crossed out, erased, as if their very existence had been repudiated by ink itself. What chills more than the content is the form. Many of these books are written in reversed script words, spelled backward sentences, mirrored, as if intended only for the eyes of those already initiated. Others are encoded in simple ciphers. Substitution systems passed down like heirlooms of secrecy. The effect is not merely to conceal it, is to trap. The writer seems to address no reader at all, only themselves, turning language into a cage for thought. Among the fragments are passages drifting beyond family record into obsession. Dreams are chronicled in painstaking detail. Watchers in the woods, figures standing at the clearing's edge, but never entering. One entry repeats the same phrase across 30 pages. They are counting us. Another describes nights when the air itself pressed down on the cabin roof, as though the sky intended to collapse inward. Here, perception and paranoia blur, leaving only unease. And what strikes most is the sheer volume of record-keeping. Families with no schoolings who signed land deeds with marks nonetheless filled entire volumes with notes, diagrams, and tables. Some recorded room dimensions, bed positions, dates livestock fell ill, as though compiling evidence for some unseen overseer. Writing itself became compulsion, an attempt to anchor memory in a place where memory was already slipping away. To modern eyes, these journals offer a window into hidden domestic worlds, lives lived inward, guarded by silence, bound by ritual. Yet, they are also evidence of a community consuming itself through obsession. Every line circles back to secrecy. Every record insists on being hidden. Every entry adds another layer of distance from the world outside. When the families eventually abandoned their homes, they carried little but left behind words. Words written in code, in mirror script, in repetition. Words that sought not explanation but preservation. Words that still sit in dust-laden chests waiting for an eye willing to decipher them. The journals remain long after the voices have gone, and in their pages, the walls of the hollow close tighter, whispering, not what happened, but what was feared. For decades, the hollow had remained invisible, its families bound by secrecy and marked by their own inward bloodlines. But beneath their soil lay seams of black carbon, thick as walls waiting to be unearthed. When prospectors stumbled upon it in the early 20th century, the mountains themselves seemed to betray their long-kept secret. What had been forgotten was now coveted and industry crept into the hollow with the slow inevitability of smoke. The coal company arrived first, bearing promises, wages and new economy homes arranged in orderly rows. Families long cut off found themselves suddenly caught it. By 1912, roads that once dissolved into mud were widened for machinery. The silence of the town broke to the sound of drills and picks, to the endless coughing of the earth itself. For the first time, outsiders arrived not as wanderers but as laborers. Men from Kentucky, Pennsylvania, even distant Europe, drawn by the lure of work. Prosperity followed, but it was brittle, the kind of wealth that leaves nothing but dust in its wake. A company store rose at the hollow's edge, shelves stacked with goods few could pay for in coin. Script replaced dollars. Thin slips issued by the mine-binding workers, not just to labor but to dependents. The air thickened with soot. Children's faces turned grey before their youth had ended, lungs coated in the dust of wages. Yet, beneath the surface, the old patterns endured. The town's families did not mingle freely with newcomers. Even as the company expanded, the kin network remained intact, clinging to customs journals and silence. Marriages between outsiders and blue-tinged descendants were rare, whispered as violations of unspoken law. In the labor camps, workers spoke of the mountain folk who lived apart, appearing in town only to trade, then vanishing back into the trees before nightfall. The boom years were brief, as they always are. Coal gave, but coal also consumed. By the late 1920s, output faltered. Accidents claimed lives. Shafts collapsed. Explosions reverberated through tunnels. Fires ignited deep in the seams below. The same fire that had powered the town now gnawed at its foundations, leaving a taste of ash on every breath. For the families who had endured in silence long before, industry arrived. The collapse was confirmation prosperity was never meant for them. When the company men pulled out, they left skeletal structures, tipples rusting against the sky rail, spurs severed mid-hollow stores, boarded and hollowed by wind. Wages ceased. Outsiders departed. Once again, the hollow folded inward. Coal had given them fleeting contact with the world, but it had also marked them. Their lungs dusted black, their soil fractured, their water clouded with runoff. And more than this, it had drawn eyes into a place that had thrived on invisibility. Coal promised to lift the town from silence. Instead, it left ruin, the echo of drills faintly audible in the stone, and a people folded back into shadows, carrying the ash of prosperity in their blood. When the coal seams ignited, the fire did not end. It burrowed. What began as a flare, a blast deep in the mine dismissed as routine, grew into something enduring, a slow subterranean inferno. It found oxygen in the seams, heat in the endless carbon, and room in the hollow caverns, carved by decades of excavation. The fire ran beneath the town like a second bloodstream, invisible yet expanding. Men walking the ridges above reported smoke, venting through fissures, the ground warm beneath their boots even in winter. Floors heaved, rising as though pressed by unseen hands. Wells turned acrid water, tinted with chemicals. Cattle collapsed in fields exhaling sulfur. The town itself had become a body poisoned from within. Parallels exist elsewhere in Appalachia, most famously Centralia, Pennsylvania, where coal fires smolder for decades, even centuries. But here, no agency arrived with evacuation plans, no reports, no federal budgets. The fire consumed year after year until it became the hollow's permanent condition. Children learned early to avoid patches of scorched earth that steamed in the rain. They were warned never to sleep too close to the ground, where gases seeped silently through cabin floors. Journals from this period speak of dreams filled with suffocation of air turning to ash, of lungs filling with smoke instead of breath. For these families, survival meant coexisting with the fire, living atop the chest of a sleeping beast. By the 1940s, the damage was undeniable. Rows of houses tilted where foundations cracked. The schoolhouse sagged on fractured beams, the ground beneath split by heat. Some families abandoned their homes carrying what little they could down the mountain. Others refused, insisting the fire was survivable, that they had endured worse. The hollow became a patchwork of inhabited and deserted cabins, one burning with lamplight, the next collapsing into smoldering ruin. The fire had sealed the town's fate. Even when mining ceased and machinery rusted away, the combustion continued hidden in the earth. Some claimed they could hear it at night, a low roar beneath the soil as if the mountain itself were breathing. True or not, it mattered little. The fire had become part of the hollow's identity, a wound that would not close. A permanent reminder of the bargain struck when coal was first torn from beneath the ridge. What industry had promised in prosperity, it reclaimed in ruin. The ground remained poisoned, the air heavy with toxins. Families diminished in number and strength. And above the hollow smoke continued to rise in thin white columns, long after the last miner had left. Each wisp, a signature of the fire still burning beneath. The town was no longer merely isolated, it was condemned. When the state ordered evacuation, not every family obeyed. The mine fire had rendered the ground unstable, the air toxic, and the water undrinkable. Inspectors arrived with clipboards, their boots sinking into the hollow's mud, delivering decrees of condemnation. Eminent domain was invoked, properties seized for safety, homes tagged uninhabitable. To the officials, the matter was straightforward: the land had failed. The community must disperse. Yet to families who had endured here for generations, surrendering their hollow was unthinkable. Some accepted relocation carried into neighboring towns with promises of compensation that rarely matched their loss. But others resisted. They saw not saviors but intruders. Men who arrived with threats wrote reports and left the fire still burning. For these holdouts, leaving meant severing bloodlines from the soil where they had been buried for a century. And so they remained, barricading themselves inside homes already cracking at the seams. Witness accounts from the 1950s and 60s describe shuttered cabins, smoke curling from chimneys long after the state declared them abandoned. Curtains drawn tight, doors reinforced with planks. Families who spoke to no one beyond their walls. They grew food in scorched soil, hauled water from distant springs, and buried the dead in yards the government had already condemned. Census records from this period reveal curious gaps. Households listed one decade disappear the next, only to reappear under slightly altered spellings, as though someone insisted on marking presence when none was meant to remain. Inspectors noted signs of life laundry lines strung in the woods, footprints on ash-dusted ground, yet reported them cautiously, hesitant to admit that the evacuation had failed. Paranoia was twofold. Families feared outsiders as much as officials, convinced that their hollow had become the target of a silent campaign to erase them. Some journals describe government men prowling the ridges at night, flashlights sweeping the trees. Others record the sense of being watched from cars with no plates, vehicles idling at the edge of abandoned roads before slipping away. Real or imagined? The effect was the same secrecy hardened into defiance, and defiance into an isolation more severe than ever before. Neighbors who had left told of returning years later to find old homes boarded from within, windows nailed shut, doors reinforced, chimneys bricked over to conceal smoke. Inside, life persisted in shadows. Kerosene lamps burned. Jars of preserved food lined shelves. Furniture was pressed against walls as if to seal the house from the world. These holdouts did not wish to be seen, they only wished to remain. The fate of these families is uncertain. Some undoubtedly perished quietly, their cabins collapsing inward as the fire smoldered beneath. Others may have slipped deeper into the mountains, carrying their lineage into new, unmarked places. What is certain is that the state never fully emptied the hollow. Even after maps labeled it abandoned, the presence of those who defied exile lingered half-documented in census gaps, half-whispered in stories of light in supposedly deserted houses. The evacuation was official. The hollow remained inhabited by those who trusted no authority but their own blood, by those who believed leaving would mean forgetting who they were. By the 1960s, entire families vanished without graves. The fire beneath the earth had already thinned the settlement, driving out many. What followed was not evacuation, it was erasure. Names that had persisted across generations, carved into journals, whispered through kinship lines, simply ceased. Cabins stood with doors ajar. Meals left unfinished on tables. Beds pressed with the impression of bodies that never returned. No burials marked their absence. No funerals were observed. The families were gone, and with them, the certainty of the town's survival. State records offer only faint glimpses of these vanishings. Missing persons. Bulletins circulated in nearby counties. Children last seen playing near streams that no longer flowed. Men who never returned from the mines, though no cave-in occurred. Mothers gone after walking into the woods for water. For each bulletin, there are countless more that were never written, never recorded, never spoken aloud. The majority of the hollow's residents lived beyond official oversight. Their disappearances were not crimes to be solved. They were voids unacknowledged by authorities who had already declared the town extinct. In the vacuum of explanation, folklore flourished. Some whispered of abductions, families taken in the night by forces unseen. Others spoke of cults, of rituals carried out in barns, lit only by firelight, where offerings were made to preserve the hollow against the encroachment of the outside world. The journals from this period grew stranger still. Pages filled with repetitive phrases, fragments of scripture distorted into command drawings of circles, and eyes inked with unsettling precision. One fragment reads simply, "We go where they call us." Investigators who ventured near the settlement reported nothing more than silence. Cabins fully furnished but empty. Doors unbroken. Belongings left behind as if the owners meant to return. In one, a table remained set for supper dust, gathering on food long turned to rot. In another, children's shoes were lined neatly at the foot of a bed with no children to claim them. Such details found their way into police notes but were dismissed as symptoms of a community unraveling under stress. Yet, the scale of absence was difficult to ignore. By the late 1970s, census data already fractured by gaps and errors, showed entire branches of family networks vanishing between decades. Surnames that had persisted in the hollow for over a century stopped without warning. To genealogists, it appeared as a sudden severing of lines, as though the mountain itself had swallowed them whole. Folklore merged with fear. Hikers passing near the hollow reported pale forms moving between trees, vanishing when approached. Others swore they heard voices at night, chanting in rhythm, with the hiss of fire escaping from cracks in the ground. The stories were inconsistent, but their persistence testified to a void that demanded explanation. In truth, no graves were ever found, no bodies recovered. The families left no physical trace of departure, only their absence. What remained was the eerie stillness of a place once inhabited, now hollowed out, not by fire or exile, but by disappearance itself. By the close of the 20th century, the vanishings had accumulated into legend. A town where families did not simply die, they dissolved, leaving behind only unanswered questions and cabins standing like monuments to lives erased. The hollow had survived fire and neglect, but it could not survive the vanishing of its own blood. The last standing church rang its bell, even after no one remained to answer. For decades, faith had been the fragile thread binding the hollow's families together. Revivalism had swept through Appalachia in the late 19th century, bringing preachers into remote hollows with promises of redemption. Even here, a crude wooden chapel had been raised on a rise above the creek. Its walls, hand-hewn benches, roughly planed, bell-cast from iron, hauled at great effort through mountain passes. The church was not merely a house of worship, it was a declaration that the settlement, though unseen, still belonged to something beyond itself. But as families vanished and houses fell silent, the church became less a gathering place than a relic. Its windows cracked rain pouring freely across the pulpit. Moss crept up its foundations. Still on Sundays, smoke rose from its chimney. Witnesses claimed a single figure, always indistinct, would cross the threshold, strike the bell rope, and sit alone in prayer. The sound carried far across the hollow, tolling through valleys already emptied of voices. To hear it was to be reminded that faith outlived the faithful. Or perhaps that ritual once begun resists extinction. The graveyard beside the church tells the story in harsher lines. Stones tilt at odd angles, names worn illegible by time and weather. Some plots remain unmarked, heaps of stone indicating burials without inscriptions. Others are marked only with initials, Ellerba abbreviations. Of lives never entered into state records, these graves multiplied through the 19th century, slowed during the industrial boom, then ceased abruptly as vanishings overtook deaths. The cemetery became not a place of mourning, but of dissonance, a ledger of absence, where the last burials predated the last families. Inside the church, remnants linger. Hymnals with torn spines, pages smudged by decades of handling margins, filled with annotations, verses underlined cryptic notes scrawled beside familiar psalms. One Bible lies open on the altar pages, warped by moisture. Eternally turned to Ezekiel visions of wheels within wheels, of a valley filled with bones. Its presence seems deliberate, as though the text itself bears witness to the hollow's condition. By the mid-20th century, revivalism elsewhere in Appalachia surged tent meetings, gospel choirs, mass baptisms. Here, by contrast, faith collapsed into solitude. Collective ritual dissolved, replaced by solitary repetition. Families once raised in hymn and sermon spoke prayers only within their homes or scratched fragments of scripture into their journals. The church remained not a center but a witness, its silence broken only by the occasional toll of the bell echoing unanswered across the hollow. Local accounts insist the bell rang even after the church was abandoned. Hikers in the 1980s reported hearing it strike at dusk, though the building stood locked and decaying. Others swore the sound was carried by the wind, metal long fallen silent. Whatever the truth, the bell became a symbol of persistence, a ritual severed from its congregation faith, detached from its believers, sound without meaning. In the end, the church joined the cabins and mines in ruin. Yet its memory endures differently. Where houses crumbled into earth and mines filled with water, the image of the chapel, its bell tolling over empty pews, remains etched in the imagination. The hollow's faith did not die with its people. It lingered fractured and spectral, ringing into silence long after there was no one left to hear. Scattered notes reveal the town's children were subjects of their own kin. Among the journals and scraps retrieved from abandoned homes, certain pages diverge from obsessive genealogies and fractured prayers. These are written not in the tone of confession but of observation, clinical in detachment, as though the writer no longer recorded family life but conducted study upon it. The handwriting belongs not to doctors but to fathers' uncles, elder siblings' kin, cataloguing the young as if they were specimens. Measurements recur with chilling precision: heights, recorded monthly pulse rates, notated alongside sketches of veins. Skin colors are compared on scales ranging from pale ash to deep blue. Methemoglobinemia, once a family peculiarity, transformed into an object of fixation. Infant cries are described dispassionately rasping, thin, absent of strength, while older children are subjected to endurance tests, held breath time before collapse pulse recovery. Columns of notes appear copied from a textbook that never existed outside the hollow. The pattern suggests more than curiosity. In the early 20th century, eugenics filtered through Appalachia, subtle but pervasive, from state sterilization programs to county health surveys targeting the rural poor. Though no official record links this town, the journals suggest its families absorbed the language of the era and turned it inward. Where doctors elsewhere sought to control heredity through law, here it was practiced in secret cabins. Kin, nesting, kin, isolation itself, demanding experiment. One recovered notebook bears the initials of a family long erased from census rolls. Crude diagrams trace family trees marked not with names but symbols: deformity, pallor, or death. Certain branches end abruptly crossed through with a line and the word failed. The implication is unmistakable. Children judged unfit were removed not only from records but perhaps from life itself. No graves accompany these notations. No birth certificates remain. Only the silent suggestion of lives terminated under the guise of preserving blood. County officials in later decades sealed records citing medical confidentiality and ongoing investigations. Requests under state archives, laws return only pages blacked out by redaction. Yet fragments of correspondence survive: letters between local authorities and state health departments, warning of familial degeneracy and the complications of enforcement. These bureaucratic phrases cloak what the journals already lay bare: children raised less as heirs than as test subjects. The horror lies not only in the experiments themselves, but in their intimacy. These were not strangers in white coats, but kin. Fathers measuring daughters, mothers recording the skin tints of sons, uncles timing the collapse of nephews. The study of life reduced to a ledger of survival observation, an unspoken cruelty written in the hands that should have offered only care. The act of observation had become indistinguishable from control. Affection was replaced by analysis duty, by cold arithmetic. The journals never admit to harm, yet their silences speak louder than any confession. When a child's entries end abruptly, a column left blank, no explanation follows. What remains is absence, a hollow where life should persist but does not. In the secrecy of the hollow, ethics collapsed inward just as bloodlines had. Out of this collapse emerged not faith or prosperity, but a clinical horror, a community turning its children into data, its own bloodlines into experiments, its silence, the only surviving record of what had been done. When industry abandoned the hollow, it left behind more than rusting equipment and broken promises. The earth itself bore scars, a labyrinth of shafts, tunnels, and chambers, collapsing under their own weight. These voids, once the arteries of coal extraction, became industrial graves, sealed not by stone, but by silence. To descend into them today is to step into a tomb, carved by human hands, where every wall still breathes with soot. Exploration records from the 1970s and 80s describe these remains with a tone both clinical and uneasy. Miners' helmets, long extinguished, lie in shallow pools where groundwater seeps through fractured rock. Carts filled with ore stand rusted in place, frozen mid-shift, waiting for men who never returned. Timber supports bow inward, blackened and splintered, groaning under the weight of the mountain pressing down. In these shafts, time has not merely passed, it has congealed, holding artifacts in suspension as if the work could resume at any moment. Yet, it is not the stillness that unsettles. It is the sound. Accounts mention distant thuds echoing through sealed corridors, rhythmic vibrations suggesting movement where none should exist. Some describe hollow knocking at irregular intervals as though tools strike stone in tunnels long collapsed. Others speak of whispers, a collective hum, traveling with draughts of air indistinguishable from the breathing of the mind itself. These sounds have never been recorded with certainty, yet their persistence across testimonies hints at something embedded in the earth memory machinery, or something less explainable. Artifacts recovered from deep within the unease are fragments of lives folded into the hollow. Lanterns with cracked glass still bearing soot. A child's shoe discovered at the edge of a collapsed chamber, its origin untraceable. Bottles of laudanum tucked into niches, left perhaps by men seeking escape from dust-laden lungs. Each object is a fragment of existence lost in the collapse of industry and family alike. To archaeologists of labor, they are invaluable. To those who enter the shafts, they are offerings left to an earth that never returned them. The atmosphere inside these mines suffocates even without smoke. Air grows thin, heavy with the mineral tang of pyrite and damp coal. In some tunnels, heat radiates upward, a reminder of the fire still smoldering unseen in deeper seams. The ground trembles faintly, as though shifting with something buried beneath. The effect is less abandonment than suspension, as if the mines are not empty, but awaiting the return of their occupants. Locals today avoid the entrances, describing them as mouths exhaling not air but voices. On certain nights, they say the hollow resonates with a low roar, neither wind nor fire, carrying the suggestion that work continues unfinished, eternal. Whether these sounds are born of geology, machinery, or imagination, they keep the ruins alive, industrial graves that will not settle. The shafts are empty of men, but not of presence. In their depths, the town's history remains entombed, echoing the labor of those who dug too deep and the silence of those who never left. The hollow above and below is a cemetery. Homes crumble. The church falls, but the mines endure black corridors of memory, where stone itself remembers the sound of work and still mimics it. Above, the town is preserved like a corpse in open air. The fire consumed the ground beneath. The mines collapsed into darkness. The surface hardened into a museum of abandonment. Cabins lean, but do not fall. The schoolhouse stands roof caved in one corner chalkboard, smeared with outlines of lessons erased by rain. Desks remain bolted to the floor, some carved with initials of children who never grew to adulthood. Every object, every shadow, every whisper is testimony. The hollow lives in memory, in stone, in soot, and in silence. An eternal archive of lives folded, observed, and never forgotten. The silence within the hollow is total, broken only by the subtle creak of plaster as wind presses through shattered windows. State photographic surveys from the late 20th century, undertaken to document Appalachian decline, captured these remnants with a disquieting precision. In black and white plates, the school appears frozen mid-sentence books. Left open on desks, slates cracked but not discarded, a globe tilted on its stand, pointing to oceans, once beyond the comprehension of the hollow's children. The images confirmed what visitors later whispered: the town had not been emptied gradually, but abandoned. Suddenly, its objects left behind, like the possessions of the dead. Homes tell the same story. Tables still bare, cracked dishes, utensils rusting beside them. Bedding remains folded at the foot of frames. Quilts patterned in hand-stitched geometry colors, faded but intact. Furniture sags under layers of dust but persists. Each piece a testimony to continuity, broken not by decay but by absence. The ruin is not of fire or storm, it is the ruin of lives halted mid-gesture. Civic buildings, if they can be called such, reflect the same stasis. A single store shelves warped with damp still contains jars clouded by age labels, peeled contents visible through glass. Canned goods sit untouched, tin corroded but unopened as though awaiting customers who never arrived. Even the company office, a two-room shack once used to distribute scrip, holds ledgers thick with unpaid debts, ink legible decades later, as if the accounts themselves expected resolution. This preservation unsettles because it resists finality. A burned town is mourned, a collapsed one is buried, but a town preserved in open air lingers in refusal, neither alive nor dead. The hollow seems perpetually paused, caught in the moment of its departure, its artifacts frozen as though awaiting return. Visitors describe a peculiar tension in the silence. A chair half pulled from a table seems recently vacated. Doors left ajar suggest imminent re-entry. Even the overgrown graveyards give the impression of interrupted maintenance, not finality. The town does not read as forgotten. It reads as interrupted, a life paused with the expectation of resumption that never came. Forensic Clinical, almost staged The Hollow, insists on being read as evidence. Every artifact left behind testifies not to ruin, but to vanishing. The town above ground is no less a grave than the mines below. It is the corpse of a community, exposed to daylight, preserved not by embalming, but by abandonment. And like any corpse left in the open air, it draws not closure, but unease. Satellite imagery adds a modern horror. Light appears in windows where no one should live. Official records declare the hollow uninhabited for decades, its last residents relocated or vanished buildings condemned. Yet data refuses to comply. Environmental monitoring, designed for broader purposes, reveals faint but consistent light signatures within the abandoned grid. The schoolhouse roof, partially collapsed, registered a glow in its central room on at least 3 occasions between 2012 and 2019. Power lines to the area have long been severed. Census anomalies deepen the mystery. Population counts list the hollow at 0, yet names appear sporadically in county registers. Surnames identical to those erased a generation ago, attached to no other addresses. Cross-checking dissolves them. No tax records, no licenses, no burial notices. They exist only in fragments, unexplained and unclaimed, as though someone insists on asserting presence while remaining invisible. Requests under the Freedom of Information Act uncovered partially redacted reports. A 1994 document mentions continued habitation not officially acknowledged. Another from 2007 refers to unverified light activity consistent with lanterns or fire. The most chilling, a 2016 notation census interference suspected, recommend suppression. Here in the hollow absence is not emptiness. It is insistence. Persistence without bodies, light without occupants. The town remains lingering between the living and the dead, observed yet unclaimed, a spectral imprint refusing erasure. The authorship of these reports is obscured, the details blacked out. Only the unease remains. First-hand accounts confirm a pattern that defies reason. Hikers venturing near the hollow report glimpsing figures at dusk, shapes too distant for detail, retreating quickly when observed. One pauses on a ridge to see smoke curling from a chimney, though maps show the structure collapsed decades ago. Another approaches the schoolhouse and hears the faint cadence of footsteps across wood, even though the floor has long rotted through. None of these witnesses returned for verification. Each carries the same impression. They were noticed intruding on a place that does not wish to be seen. The contradictions resist resolution. Hunter-squatters, wandering vagrants, none fully account for census anomalies, recurring surnames, or the persistent glow in structures without power. Officially abandoned, the hollow behaves as if still occupied, blurring the line between the living and the vanished. To study it today is to confront data, insisting on presence while institutions insist on absence. Satellite imagery, sporadic census entries, partially redacted FOIA reports, they accumulate like layers of evidence in a case no one will prosecute. The effect is not discovery but dissonance, the uneasy recognition that erasure is never absolute. In Appalachia, silence often conceals history. Here, silence conceals something less certain, a community that may not have ended but transformed. Its existence reduced to flickers of light, ghostly entries in bureaucratic ledgers, and fleeting glimpses that vanish when approached. Visitors report unmarked cars forcing them back. The hollow, absent from maps and officially uninhabitable, does not rest. Those attempting to reach it, curious hikers, amateur historians, descendants of the vanished, describe a barrier neither natural nor accidental. On winding roads approaching the hollow, black or grey vehicles materialize plates untraceable. They idle at intersections, appear in rearview mirrors, communicate without words, turn back. Highway patrol logs from nearby counties hint at increased federal presence in the late 1980s and early 2000s, though no explanation is provided. Officials neither confirm nor deny. Their silence is the message. Witnesses accumulate like ash. A genealogist tracing family lines toward the hollow is followed for 20 miles. The car behind disappears suddenly. A researcher encounters a sedan blocking the narrow road to the old schoolhouse. No driver emerges, no words are exchanged. The warning is absolute: turn back. Some interpret this as intimidation, an effort to prevent discovery. Others suggest containment, an invisible perimeter designed to keep something in rather than keep strangers out. In either case, the result is the same. The hollow persists not as a ruin, but as a restricted zone, its silence enforced by unseen forces. FOIA requests returned in recent decades are heavily redacted. One refers to continued anomalous habitation situation controlled. Another notes recurrent trespasses deterred. The details, like the vehicles themselves, are obscured. What is certain, the hollow has not been allowed to fade naturally into history. Its absence is actively maintained. Locals whisper of warnings from strangers who vanish as quickly as they arrive. Hikers report being turned back sometimes with flashing headlights, sometimes by silent vehicles across the road, engines idling. The effect is absolute. No one attempts entry twice. And the question lingers, impossible to dismiss: if the town is truly dead, its ruins pose no threat. If its family is vanished, their memory should rest only in archives. Yet secrecy suggests otherwise. Something remains. Something insists. The hollow is alive in its absence, a space that refuses erasure, a shadow of presence that no law, no map, no census can contain. The hollow is not merely abandoned. It is guarded as though its silence must be enforced. Among the last remnants, a journal offers the final word discovered decades after the last official resident vanished. In rough, hurried handwriting, it reads, "We never left. We're waiting for the world to forget." The line closes the record more decisively than any government seal. Beyond unmarked cars, beyond census anomalies, beyond the silence of maps, the hollow itself asserts that absence is not emptiness, it is presence enduring waiting. The sentence appears at the bottom of a narrow page, written with a tremor in the hand that carried it. No entries follow. The ink halts, the book closes, and the hollow resumes its silence. Yet these few words outlive every other record resonating as testimony. The preceding pages are mundane births, tallied crops counted, marriages sketched. Nothing predicts the weight of the final declaration. They are neither prophecy nor warning, but a claim the hollow's families, long erased from census and memory, had not vanished. Other evidence amplifies the unease. Census records continue to yield anomalies. Surnames identical to those buried in the hollow reappear decades later, attached to no verifiable household. Hikers report flickering lights in homes without power figures glimpsed behind broken window frames, smoke rising from chimneys long cold. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy, follow travelers on empty roads, though no one is ever found. The pattern is unprovable, yet persistent, suggesting endurance beyond imagination. "We never left" implies more than survival. It gestures toward permanence, an existence threaded through the hollow itself, invisible yet intact. And the second half, "We're waiting for the world to forget," chills further. It speaks not of reintegration, not of return, but of deliberate erasure. The hollow thrives in shadow, maintained by silence and neglect. To wait for the world to forget is to claim permanence in disappearance. The journal bears no signature. Whether written by a patriarch, a mother protecting her children, or a solitary survivor chronicling the end of a town, the words read as collective a voice for every life once present. The story ends not with closure but with persistence. The hollow remains officially abandoned roads, eroded homes collapsing, its name erased from maps. Yet silence here is not empty. It is occupied by records that refuse to fade, anomalies that resist explanation, and a final line that denies resolution. The church bell is quiet. The schoolhouse roof collapsed. Mines filled with smoke. But in a forgotten journal, the hollow still speaks. We never left. We are waiting for the world to forget. In those words, absence becomes presence, silence becomes testimony, and forgetting the act, most natural, becomes the most dangerous act of all.